Howdy, y'all. My name is Cathryn Ploehn. I go by Cat. My pronouns are she or they. And I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, teaching interaction design and data visualization through the lens of ecology. This is my website that I'm conveniently showing y'all. Today, though, I'm sharing with y'all my research practice, which is called feral data visualization, which reimagines data visualization for the ecological, queer, feminist, and embodied using botanical simulation. Of course, I teach at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm speaking to y'all from Austin, but also I'm speaking to y'all from a specific ecological place or bioregion. I'm at the cross section of the Crossland Timbers and Blackland Prairies, two bioregions home to familiar flora and fauna like grackles, our famous bird, pecan trees, and live oaks, all of which host countless insects and birds like the grackles, but many other types of flora that are underappreciated but persistent, like lamb's quarters and purslane, who regenerate disturbed soil, but also historically have fed the humans living on these lands. There's this delicate mesh of life immediately around me that makes life possible here in Austin, the Blackland Prairies, Turtle Island, including my own. But it's so very easy to forget that our lives are intertwined with just a few inches of topsoil. And yet for a large chunk of my youth and for many others like me, the living and dying of the plants in my hometown of suburban Dallas remained an illegible language. We are so biologically and otherwise interdependent upon land and place, and yet so many of us are strangers to the flora and fauna, the fungi making clean air and water possible, blind to even the shape of a pecan leaf. Instead, I was very busy pursuing my academics and my career. And after my bachelor's degree, I researched and made data visualizations at the National Institute of Standards and Technologies here in the United States. And I read some of the big dataviz hits at the time, encountering the best practices, emphasizing data, ink, rich geometric forms, lines, circles, squares, and so on. You can see my ggplot cheat sheet here, which was my best friend in those days, still is. These practices are very appealing in their minimalism, but they come at a cost. They simplify the phenomena described through data and obscure the hand and land of the designer. In other words, my nascent dataviz practice was also estranged from place and ecology. That is to say, our data visualizations reflect our own estrangement from the ecologies our lives depend on. That might seem innocent, but estrangement from ecology is actually a fertile ground for destruction. We readily extract from quote unquote natural resources that are framed to us as invisible, inert, or as objects, pushing the world's ecosystems to the brink. You might know, of course, we're experiencing a warming climate, but also a big extinction at the time, to say the least. This pattern of extraction through disembodiment, or as some people say, othering, repeats everywhere in struggles for justice. And we see this dynamic in moments where violence is somehow justified. We're seeing a lot of that in the news and historically. Meanwhile, weirdly enough, we see this pattern of extraction through disembodiment in our own dataviz practices. Specifically, the practice of dataviz often requires a transformation of the world and its phenomena into computable bits of data. It can be often a very violent reduction of phenomena into categories for analysis and, by extension, control. For artist and author James Bridle, this violence emerges from forcing the world to conform to that representation, which erases, degrades, tortures, and kills those things and beings which do not fit within the assumed system of representation. And reading this paper here on screen, Feminist Data Visualization by Cathryn D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein, 2016, introduced me to this notion and horrified me, because I love dataviz, forcing me to reflect upon this kind of violence in often very, very useful data visualization norms. And I even pursued a master's thesis at Carnegie Mellon in interaction design to digest these norms into my own practice. And of course, this paper turned into the book Data Feminism, which came out, I think, in 2020. Very good book. by the way. But what are these norms? Some of them are on screen. Color schemes belie the in-betweenness erased from the imposition of categories. Jenny Odell has a great talk on the in-between, by the way. Abstract shapes also disembody the phenomena described by the data, and an abstract body is easier to analyze, control, and manipulate. So that leaves us looking at a data visualization, relating to it, interacting with it, in this kind of posture of analysis and control, for better, for worse. Thinking, how does this compare to that? And studies have shown that minimalist geometric forms emit this kind of truthfulness that's actually kind of a hallucinated objectivity, whereas knowledge is actually situated in who created it, which you can read papers from Donna Haraway and Joanna Drucker about this kind of feminist take on knowledge is situated. But one thing really stuck out to me. By centering abstract and disembodied forms, the prevailing aesthetics of data visualization actually also mirror our disengagement with place-based ecology. In other words, estrangement sets the seed for the extraction of our ecologies to the point of crisis, and our data visualization practices tend to be complicit. Now, don't get me wrong, I still use these geometric primitives, these aesthetic norms, for a good chunk of my practice while making dataviz, and they're still quite useful. But there's also a critical need to reflect and put into balance this type of practice with something else. And this is really demonstrated when we visualize data such as ones about death. This is from very dithered, I like dither, this is a very dithered image from the New York Times during the COVID lockdown during 2020. I wonder how we might move beyond a posture of analysis when we encounter data like this. So instead of comparing September, oh, we're at a trough, to May, oh, we're at a peak, how can we move out of that comparison and control? In other words, how might we reimagine data visualization away from extraction? But I kind of want to zoom out a little bit and thinking, okay, regardless of data visualization, how do we encounter extraction and estrangement in the first place? What kind of mindset should we have to encounter our own crises and the extraction that fuels it? So in the midst of crisis fueled by estrangement, our path forward must mend our relationship with the living world through a responsibility toward it. We must share the stakes of living and dying. So again, for scholars like Donna Haraway and Ursula Le Guin, de-estrangement means building a sense of shared fate as beings of the earth. It means making kin. In making kin, the distinction between us and quote unquote nature melts away into a solidarity of our entangled fate in living. There's no going out into nature. You are nature, you're in it. Pretty crazy. In other words, we acknowledge our reliance on symbiosis with the plants, animals, and fungi around us, and in the case of our microbiome, inside of us too. In forging kinfolk, attention is the starting point. As author and artist Jenny Odell writes, when we behold each other, we become beholden to one another. Potawatomi botanist and author Robin Wall Kimmerer argues that paying attention is a form of reciprocity with the living world. That is to say, we must behold the intelligence and language of our ecologies around us immediately. The visual evidence of living, dying, growing, decaying that are shown in the plants, fungi, animal, and more all around us, outside your window, maybe in your home. So while pursuing my master's degree and grappling with the countless problems that I saw in dataviz as revealed by many wonderful artists and scholars, I mentioned Joanna Drucker, Jenny Odell, Donna Haraway, Mimi Onuoha, I found myself while grappling with those problems in Western Pennsylvania, where I could very easily travel to witness some of the remaining old growth forests in the continent, forests that are never before cut down. On my first visit to one of these parts of the forest in a mushroom club's foray, I found myself very lost in an incomprehensible density of woods and life. Pretty terrifying as a suburban kid, doubly terrifying as a suburban kid from the prairie. The trees, and this is a picture on screen of one of those trees it's looking up at. The trees exhaled clouds of mist while polypores, these beautiful burgundy mushrooms, emerged from deep beds of moss. Now, in grad school, I was reading theory about deep ecology, Gaian systems, and the ecological turn. Being here was nothing like the theory. It was overwhelming, and I stood in the beautiful presence of these massive eastern hemlock trees before me. Now, beholding these eastern hemlock trees made me start to become beholden to not only their beauty, but how they lived and died. So in the face of crisis, in summary, we must make kin with our ecologies through paying attention to them. But loving those trees while you're in their forest is easy. In everyday suburban life and urban life, otherwise full of concrete and screens, holding this kind of ecological attention is a very delicate matter. For Ursula Le Guin, making kin is a great reach outward of the mind and imagination. For her, it was supported through the use of tools like poetry. But as a dataviz designer, selfishly, and also one who loves justice-oriented projects, I was pondering, well, how can dataviz help? In structuring our attention to the phenomena of the world, data visualization seems like poised as the most potent tool for kinship. And in fact, one of my favorite authors and artists, James Bridle, again, acknowledges that noticing our symbiosis, potentially through tools for gathering and displaying data, is a potential balm for the opaque technological infrastructures of systems of analysis, determination, and control, many of which rely on data and visualization to exert power. But despite the promise of using data for good, like I mentioned before, the familiar theories and methods of visualizing data in neat, minimalist shapes were at odds with beholding the truly unruly nature of symbiosis. So in my master's degree, I'm like, okay, well, what else am I going to do? How can we reimagine data for making kin? That's when I began to make my escape from the confines of simple geometry. Outside the cage of primitive shapes emerged my practice, feral data visualization, which reimagines data visualization for the ecological, queer, feminist, and embodied using botanical simulation. Feral dataviz reorients dataviz as a kin-making tool. Each project takes the form of a hand-coded botanical simulation that attempts to tell us about data while embedding the stories of plant life that find a way between the cracks of our earth in crisis. By botanical simulation, I mean things like L systems. Zoom in here. This is from the book Algorithmic Beauty of Plants, but also things like phyllotaxis and space colonization and other kind of algorithms, but made bespoke to a place. So encountering data through the visual language of a place-based botanical simulation might offer us an alternative to the typical attention of control and analysis that a geometric type dataviz gives us. Instead, botanical simulations ask us to behold the data encoded. In this sense, beholding means a special kind of attention, a special kind of observation without the intent for control or instrumentalization. You might be familiar from perhaps Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing. There's mention of a philosopher, Martin Buber, who wrote about I-it versus I-thou kind of attention. Or you might have read The Spiral Dance, which is a book about witchcraft, in which the author compares flashlight vision versus starlight vision. I'm talking about the I-thou, the starlight vision, the noticing without controlling. Mindfulness, maybe. I want to lay out 3 qualities of botanical simulation that might create space for the possibility of beholding. And those include place-based metaphor, embodiment, and care. And I'll talk through each of these qualities through the lens of 2 of my feral dataviz projects. In my project, Suga Convictio, which was my grad school thesis, master's thesis, I experimented with using a cellular automata simulation of old growth Eastern hemlock roots to tangibly demonstrate the vitality and interconnected nature of the community of my grad school cohort. Old growth forests, like the Eastern hemlock forests of Western Pennsylvania that I just mentioned, they connect and share nutrients through networks of rhizomes. These networks are a natural metaphor for communities of people whose feelings of vivaciousness and weariness can spread throughout the community, like the concept of social contagion, but also represents how we depend on one another around us in community. So very quickly, I'll just show you the dataviz. So what's happening here is each tree is assigned a random kind of level of vivaciousness. And the trees or the people not feeling as vivacious, their roots will grow less densely and robustly, and the folks feeling more vivacious will have more robust roots. So you can see that in the legend on the left. So 3 things are happening here. First, this is a place-based botanical form, which in its design reveals the story of the designer, me, my ecological home at the time in Western Pennsylvania. In visualizing these interconnected Eastern hemlock roots, the data visualization conveys my relationship with those forests in Western Pennsylvania. And this placefulness of the visualization conveys the situatedness and constructedness of the data in time, place, culture, and person, which is kind of a thing for feminist knowledge practices. Secondly, this generative system, the simulation, offers a more poetic embodied display of feeling that affords an ambiguity and eludes a neat categorization. There's an intentional gradient between the roots as the trees connect with one another. There's an intentional fuzziness of the weaker trees versus the stronger trees, sort of in the middle. And this like ambiguity of the botanical form, the rhizomes and leaves, again, defy kind of a neatness of categorization that kind of interrupts the mood of analyzing, inviting you to just kind of notice. And these wiggly cellular automata roots of these simulated trees convey that scale of vivaciousness from barren to dense without sharp edges. So whereas a geometric data viz obscures a body as encoded by data, this botanical data viz centers plant bodies as tangible displays of living and dying. Simulated roots grow before your eyes. Conveying an active reaching out of support towards one another. After learning the language of this data visualization, perhaps it may leave a mark of familiarity and recognition. The vision of interconnected Eastern hemlock roots leaves an imprint on the mind. Vegetizing your sensorium, in the words of one of my favorite anthropologists, Natasha Myers. Vegetizing your sensorium towards these delicate ecosystems fighting for life. Perhaps the next time you look at a tree, kind of imagine their root networks, wondering if they connect to each other. After grad school, completing this thesis, I returned to my home bioregion of the Blackland Prairies, Austin, Texas, and began designing data visualization wreaths due to lives lost from anti-trans violence in partnership with the organization Data Science. The data is collected and painstakingly archived by UK software engineer Anna Jane Metcalf. My collaborator Kelsey and I wondered how this phenomena about data about lives lost might be shown without the disembodying effect of geometric primitives and without the gender essentializing tendencies of typical humanoid icons. This is like a big conversation in this space. So I returned to the massive bald cypress trees that stabilize the edges of waterways in the region. They bear witness to water and time for hundreds of years. In fact, cypress trees on the UT Austin campus were there before the campus, the university existed. hundreds of years, and they remain as invisible shade givers to passerby on UT's campus. And yet their leaves are precious and beautiful in the palm of your hand as they shed every winter. So we created a data visualization wreath, nodding to historic mourning and grief practices. And let me zoom out and just show it to you. So we created this data visualization wreath in which each leaf holds the name of a trans or gender fluid or gender diverse person whose life was taken too soon, often through obvious violence. And in the process of my work, creating each leaf to be unique was the main focus, so that you could behold the whole collection of names. We'll even zoom in and ponder. What's interesting, though, in the creation of this wreath, in the process of this work, I found myself staring at leaves for hours, at these precious bald cypress leaves, wondering, imagining, dreaming. To create a botanical simulation true enough to the plant form, and these are not close, creating something that's close enough requires a deep attention, a deep discipline, a deep gaze. So I look at the leaves, return to the code, type some stuff out, return to the leaves, no, type some stuff out, return to the leaves. In this cycle of tinkering and pondering produced a wonder and frustration in the incomprehensible presence of just this, what would come across at first as a simple leaf. And my time with these cypress leaves provided a sort of observational knowledge, tacit, embodied, visceral, impossible to gain otherwise, impossible to gain without this kind of design process. And so in working Fearly, the most fascinating transformation emerged from within my hand and heart as a dataviz designer. In constructing a simulation about the minute visual details of the growth and decay of plant life, this kind of observation doesn't really translate in an average photo found on, say, iNaturalist, which is a plant identification app, or in a quick image search. Feral dataviz by necessity requires you to emerge from your office into the forest or the creek or the prairie and find that richness of information outside in the plants, and they will explode in beauty and complexity upon observation. And in fact, yeah, I can tell you, there's something else there. There's this ache of affection. Observation over time deepened my intimacy with these plants as they lived, expanding my capacity for care and agency, such that when I walk on UT's campus day to day, I just can't help but appreciate those cypress trees, look at their leaves as they grow each spring with a beautiful dark to light green gradient, and even notice kind of a different variety of a cypress tree and be surprised. So comparing a bald cypress to a Montezuma cypress, these little details scream at me now, whereas before they were invisible. Well, let me return to my main page. So designing through this language of botanical livability all around us might help us. Okay, thank you. Designing through this language of botanical livability around us might help us forge infinite learning and kinship through observation. We become for and of place. The effect of this practice within the designer might be the sense of belonging that, going back to the start of this presentation, might mend the pain of ecological estrangement, giving us kind of this sense of solidarity and shared living with the botanical kin all around us. And that's all I got. Thanks for your time.